Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're looking at some highly revealing open source intelligence that takes us straight into the internal communications of Iranian regime supporters. This all comes from a really comprehensive analysis by Armin Navabi of Liberty Politics. And what's so wild about this is that we aren't just looking at speculation here. We're looking at raw, leaked Telegram messages that have been intercepted and translated. These chats are giving us an unprecedented, completely unvarnished look at the internal fractures, the sheer economic panic, and the deep ideological confusion that's currently gripping the regime's most loyal base.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll go inside those leaked group chats. Then we'll look at the economic despair, specifically the empty pharmacies. After that, we'll unpack the strange paradox of exactly who they are blaming. Then we'll explore their fractured base. And finally, we'll break down what's called the W Uprising theory.
All right, part one, inside the leaked group chats. You know, to really understand a political movement, you have to look at what they say when they think the door is locked and nobody else is watching. The source material for this analysis comes from a specific, monitored Telegram messaging group. This is basically where Iranian regime loyalists and suppression force members hang out to discuss current events. And just take a look at this translated quote pulled directly from that chat. One user writes, "There's nothing left of us in 3 months. Just go and make your goddamn deal." Wow. I mean, this is definitely not the confident, unified rhetoric you hear on state television. This is a purely defeatist, totally doomer message. It establishes this immediate sense of sheer panic. The people inside this chat are expressing a genuine, deep-seated belief that they literally cannot last another few months under these pressures, and they are openly pleading for their leadership to just make a deal with the West to end the pain. And it's absolutely vital to understand the scale of this. 21,000. That number represents the massive amount of regime supporters inside this single Telegram discussion group. So we aren't just talking about an isolated comment from one disgruntled guy on the fringe. This is a huge, highly active echo chamber of loyalists. These raw emotions, these frustrations, and these desperate messages are being aired out and absorbed by tens of thousands of their peers every single day.
So what's driving all this panic? Let's move to Section 2, Economic Despair and Empty Pharmacies. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shifts us from high-level geopolitics right down to the relatable, everyday human struggle. 150,000 tomen. According to the intercepted chats, that is the exorbitant cost for just a single essential medical pill that a frustrated regime supporter needs for their nerves. They describe walking into a pharmacy, finding out they simply cannot afford the medicine they need to function, and asking out loud, "What sin did we commit?" It perfectly illustrates how this massive macroeconomic collapse is hitting the regime's own loyalists right in the medicine cabinet. And honestly, that pharmacy anecdote is just one symptom of a much larger disease. The source material identifies a cascading list of economic threats that are completely dominating these chats. They are openly discussing fears of imminent economic bankruptcy. They're bracing for spiking gasoline prices, dealing with this runaway inflation that is just crushing their purchasing power, and facing entirely unaffordable housing costs. Actually, the analyst notes that across these forums, the exact phrase economic bankruptcy is being repeated by hundreds of users. This crushing financial reality is the primary driver behind their growing anger and desperation. Which brings us to Section 3, Blaming Officials Instead of America. This is arguably the most fascinating paradox in the entire analysis. When a country faces severe economic sanctions and international isolation, you would logically expect its most hardcore loyalists to point the finger entirely outward, right? But that's not what is happening here. To understand why, we first have to decode their terminology. When these loyalists complain about the government or officials in these chats, they are making a very specific distinction. They are referring strictly to the executive branch, so currently led by President Pezeshkian. They are notably not referring to the overarching Islamic Republic as a whole, or the Supreme Leader, or the IRGC. They are selectively directing all their anger at the day-to-day administrators, essentially attempting to shield their core ideological institutions from taking any of the blame. And this brilliantly illustrates the paradox we are looking at. The expected narrative would be for these supporters to blame America and international sanctions for their empty pharmacies and crazy inflation. But the actual narrative we see unfolding in the leaks? They are fiercely blaming internal government mismanagement. So why the mental gymnastics? Well, the analyst points out a really counterintuitive truth. For a hardcore hardliner, blaming America for their economic ruin would basically be an admission of defeat. It would mean admitting that American sanctions are successfully crushing them. So to maintain their self-image of strength, They have to convince themselves that their pain isn't caused by a successful foreign power, but rather by incompetent or traitorous local officials inside their own executive branch. And all this internal finger-pointing leads us right into Section 4, a fractured and confused base. Because they are directing all this anger internally at their own executive branch, the ideological unity of the regime's loyalists is severely cracking. They are splitting on exactly how they're supposed to survive this crisis. We are seeing two radically different survival strategies emerge. On one side, you have the reformist wing. These are figures who suggest capitulation, making deals and negotiating with the West, just to ensure the regime survives. This is exactly the group that chat user was referring to when they said, just go make your goddamn deal. But then on the flip side, you have the hardline wing. Their proposed solution to the crisis is the exact opposite. They demand an even stricter, fully Islamic state, with some even suggesting they should just do away with the illusion of democratic elections entirely, because they believe the public just keeps voting for the wrong, weak executives. Now think about what this ideological split does to the actual boots on the ground, the suppression forces. Check out this translated question directly from the chats. If I go to defend this regime, am I actually defending Pezeshkian and his power? I mean, that is a staggering revelation. The individuals tasked with physically defending the regime are experiencing a profound identity crisis. Because they've been taught to hate their current executive branch for all their economic misery, they no longer know exactly whose authority they are protecting if they're ordered out into the streets to put down a protest. And this confusion is a massive, massive vulnerability, especially when you consider this number. The analyst asserts that these hardcore regime supporters, the ones actually willing to go out and suppress dissent, make up no more than 5% of the total population. 5%. When a base that small becomes ideologically fractured, economically desperate, and completely confused about who they are even fighting for, their effectiveness is going to drop dramatically. Which sets the stage perfectly for our final section, the W Uprising theory. So, based on these leaked chats and the shifting sentiment of that crucial 5%, the source material presents a really compelling analytical conclusion about the ultimate fate of the regime. The analyst, Armin Navabi, uses this coined term, the double uprising. This describes a scenario where two distinct forces combine. First, you have a revolt by the general public, which, of course, we've seen before. But the second, absolutely critical element is a simultaneous mutiny, or even just an abandonment by those disillusioned regime supporters. It's that turning point where the loyalists simply stop fighting the public. So the crucial point is how these steps interact to cause a collapse from the inside out. Step 1, broad economic hardship, like those 150,000 Toman pills and the runaway inflation, eventually triggers another mass uprising from the everyday Iranian people. But step 2 is where the dynamic totally changes. Because of all that internal confusion we just unpacked, those disillusioned, broke regime supporters who are furious at their own government simply refuse to show up to suppress the crowds. They stay home. They do this either out of protest against their own executive officials or just because they feel there is literally nothing left to defend. Which leaves us with this final, highly provocative question. If a regime's most loyal supporters, that core 5%, simply stop showing up to defend it, what happens to the regime? The leaked Telegram chats we've looked at today suggest this isn't just some abstract hypothetical anymore. It is a very real, actively developing vulnerability cracking the foundation from within. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and keep exploring the data behind these incredible geopolitical shifts. See you next time.